And here we are at Chapter 7 to talk about ventilation, perfusion, and shock. And this is the pathophysiology of how our body works. So, pathophysiology, it's the study of how diseases process, how diseases make our body or harm our body and our bodily functions. Understanding this helps you recognize the changes that the body is going through for your patient that's sick or injured. So, you need to understand how the cell works. We're going to talk about this at the cellular level, but just remember your body is made up of thousands of cells. So one cell having a dysfunction, they're all going to be dysfunctional if they don't have what they need to function. The cell is made up of a membrane that protects it. It's what keeps the contents of the cell in. But it also allows water and other substances to come into and out of the cell. Mitochondria is the part that actually creates or manufactures energy. And energy is adenosine triphosphate is energy, ATP. So when you see ATP, that's energy, and it's the fuel that's being made to keep the cell functioning. So basically it's keeping our body functioning. Without ATP, many of the cell structures could not function, and therefore we wouldn't be able to function either. So energy for the cell is produced largely by the mitochondria, the structures that are responsible for the conversion of glucose and other nutrients into energy, which is ATP. And here's a picture of the cell and all of its components. Take a note that the cell has a membrane that surrounds it, and then of course you've got the mitochondria inside. That's the where energy is produced, and that's where it makes ATP. The cells need water. There's three things the cell needs: water, glucose, and oxygen. But let's talk about the water first. You got to have the correct balance of water inside and outside the cell. If you've got too little water, then the cell is dehydrated and it can't function, it dies. If you have too much water, then it still can't function as well. It's interrupted. Water also affects the levels of electrolytes. Electrolytes are things like sodium and potassium and magnesium. Those are our electrolytes. Now think about it. When you are dehydrated, what do they tell you to drink? They tell you to drink something with electrolytes in it. Basically, the water that has extra electrolytes in it. So, water, too much water or too little water is going to affect the cell and how it functions. All right, so our cells are kind of like little refineries, and they're creating their own fuel. Just like you've got a refinery that's creating oil so that it can function, it's the same thing that happens in our bodies. So, glucose is the next thing we need for our cell to function. It's actually the building block for energy. You've got to have glucose in order for your body to create energy. What the cell does is it takes glucose and oxygen and converts that into ATP molecules. Remember, I told you ATP is energy. In order for the cell to have glucose, the glucose, you have to eat something with sugar that's going to turn into glucose, number one. And then second of all, you've got to have insulin, because insulin is the key that unlocks the cell door to let glucose in. Glucose cannot get into the cells without insulin. That means glucose will just circulate around in your bloodstream, and then you'll have high glucose levels, but none of it will get to the cells, and your cells are actually starving to death. So insulin is created in the pancreas. So if you have a pancreas problem or a condition called diabetes where you're not producing enough insulin, then you won't be able to have enough insulin to take and unlock the door to the cell for glucose to get in. So oxygen is the third thing that the cell needs. If the cell is functioning and using oxygen to convert the glucose into energy, we call that aerobic metabolism. The cell can convert the glucose into a little bit of energy without oxygen. What it does is it takes a little bit of fat and tries to convert it into energy. But that's an inefficient way of creating energy, and we call that anaerobic metabolism. The problem with anaerobic metabolism is it creates much less energy, only 3 ATP molecules. If it's creating energy using aerobic metabolism, the correct way, you'd have 36 ATP molecules. But anaerobic metabolism will create only 2, so there's a severe decrease in the amount of ATP molecules. On top of that, it creates a lactic acid, a waste product, a lot of waste product. And then that waste product is going to impair, it's going to build up into and surround the cell and cause it not to function correctly. And then you won't have, your body functions won't be very efficient. So, if the cell is creating ATP correctly, it'll take glucose, and the oxygen in the glucose will bind and create a large amount of ATP or energy. And then the body has it to function. In anaerobic metabolism, glucose will bind with fat, and it will create a little bit of ATP, not enough really for the body to function. But on top of that, it will create a pyruvic acid or a lactic acid, and that lactic acid will kill the cells. So, it's all about keeping our cells alive and making sure there's oxygen to the cells and that they're getting plenty of nutrients and that they're also having the correct amount of water inside and outside the cell. A lot of diseases can alter the permeability of the membrane. Now, permeability means the ability of the water and molecules to cross the cell membrane, to go into and out of the cell. This is important, especially in the case of electrolytes, because electrolytes need to go into and out of the cells, especially cardiac cells, the heart cells, because that's what generates our heartbeat, is that movement of electrolytes into and out of the cells. So a lot of diseases can alter the permeability of the membrane, and the cell can actually leak water out if the membrane is not functioning correctly. Um, it can also let substances into the cell that really shouldn't be there. And then these substances can interfere with the regulation of water also. You can correlate this with what we call edema or swelling.
A human cell consists of three parts: the cell membrane, the nucleus, and between the two, the cytoplasm. Every cell in the body is enclosed by a cell membrane. It maintains the integrity of a cell and controls passage of materials into and out of the cell. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. The nucleolus is a dense region of ribonucleic acid, RNA, in the nucleus, and is the site of ribosome formation. The nucleus determines how the cell will function. The cytoplasm is the gel-like fluid inside the cell. All of the functions for cell expansion, growth, and replication are carried out in the cytoplasm of a cell. Within the cytoplasm lie intricate arrangements of fine fibers and distinct structures called organelles. Each type of organelle has a specific role in the function of the cell. Examples of cytoplasmic organelles are the mitochondrion. Round, long cellular organelles produce energy for the cell through cellular respiration. Ribosomes, RNA-rich cytoplasmic granules that are sites of protein synthesis. Endoplasmic reticulum is a system of vesicular and lamellar cytoplasmic membranes that functions in the transport of materials and the Golgi apparatus. A cytoplasmic organelle that consists of a stack of membranous sacuelles and vesicles that is active in the modification and transport of proteins.
Okay, so the cardiopulmonary system and how that relates to our pathophysiology. The cardiopulmonary system is the respiratory and cardiovascular systems working together. Their purpose is to bring oxygen into the body, distribute it to the cells, and then remove the waste product. Remember what the waste product is? It's carbon dioxide. All right. Any breakdown in the cardiopulmonary system can result in system failure. So here's the airway. We have our trachea. The trachea is the windpipe down into the lungs. And remember, the mouth and nose are the entryway. But as you get to the trachea, right behind that where it's pointing to larynx, that's the thyroid cartilage. And remember what the larynx is? Right, the larynx is the voice box. It divides down into the left and right main bronchus. That's the bronchial tubes. And they divide even smaller into bronchioles. And those bronchioles lead down into little tiny air sacs called alveoli. And this is the alveoli. The alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. And those capillaries are really tight next to the membranes of the alveoli membranes, those cells. And they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, if you take a look to that left side where the bronchiole is, if you had somebody that was having maybe an asthma attack and the bronchioles were constricting, then they wouldn't be able to get air in and out of the alveoli efficiently. You would probably hear them do something called Wheezing. The airway. When we talk about airway all through class, I want you to think the airway is the structures, the tubes that bring air from the outside atmosphere down to alveoli. That means all of those structures need to be able for air to pass. If they're swelling shut, that means they don't have that capability to let the air pass efficiently. If you have a blockage, somebody choking on something or their tongue falling back, they won't have that tube open for air to get down to the lungs. Upper airway obstructions are common. You can kids especially can choke on things, or you can have an infection where those airways swell, or even trauma can damage them. The lower airway. Parts of the lower airway include the trachea, the bronchus, and the bronchioles, and then the alveoli. But the lungs are the main components of the lower airway. Tidal volume is the amount of air moving in and out every time we breathe. Tidal volume is noted. You can notice tidal volume by how much the chest rises. So when you see somebody taking a breath and their chest rises, that is tidal volume. The average amount of tidal volume that somebody breathes in, an adult male would breathe in one breath, is about 500 milliliters. Now, respiratory rate is how many times a minute somebody breathes. The average for an adult is 12 to 20 times a minute. We count a respiratory rate when we take vitals. The other thing that we talk about is minute volume, and that's how many times somebody breathes a minute and multiplied by how deep their breaths are. Their tidal volume times respiratory rate, and that equals minute volume. That's the amount of total air moved in and out of the lungs in 1 minute. If there's any change in tidal volume or respiratory rate goes down, the minute volume will go down. Respiratory dysfunction occurs anytime something interferes with minute volume. So the respiratory system is not functioning correctly, it's going to affect the minute volume. So some things that can cause that would be maybe a disruption in somebody's respiratory control. Our respirations are controlled by the brain. The brain, at the base of our brain, is something called the medulla oblongata. It's part of our brain. And if there's a problem with our breathing, it's probably originated from the medulla oblongata. Anything that affects that can affect minute volume. So if there's an infection, or if maybe certain drugs will affect that control center, toxins, or even trauma can affect the medulla oblongata. And then you would have the breathing, respiratory dysfunction, because we can't control our breathing, or the brain can't control our breathing. The other thing that can happen could be a disruption in pressure. If our chest is damaged, then there could be a puncture, a rib fracture. That's the structures of our lungs, and it's going to affect our ability to inhale and exhale. And there again, minute volume is reduced. You could also have air or blood accumulating in the chest and putting pressure on it, and then you wouldn't be able to breathe. The pleural space is the lining on the lungs. There's uh, two linings on the lungs. One is the lining around the rib cage, and one is the lining on the lung itself. Those two linings stick together with just a little bit of fluid so they can rub across each other without friction. One is called the parietal pleura, one is called the visceral pleura. Remember to look up. Is the parietal pleura the one attached to the ribs, or is the visceral pleura the one attached to the ribs? Look that up in your book and see if you can tell us in class. There could be a disruption of lung tissue. Trauma or medical problems can compromise the ability of the alveoli to exchange gases. Let's say the lungs are just a muscle, the alveoli are part of those muscles, and let's say that there's bleeding into and around that tissue. That's going to compromise the ability of the alveoli to exchange gases. Less oxygen gets in and less carbon dioxide gets out. This will result in low oxygen levels, which we call hypoxia. Not enough oxygen. Or it could cause high carbon dioxide levels, which is called hypercapnia. The body attempts to compensate for gas exchange deficits by breathing faster, sometimes breathing deeper, or even shallower. This is controlled by the chemoreceptors in our blood vessels. They're in the aortic arch and they're in the carotid arteries. These chemoreceptors, or chemical receptors, what do you suppose what chemical they're detecting? Well, yeah, it's carbon dioxide for the main part. Sometimes oxygen, but it looks at our carbon dioxide levels, and if there's too much waste product circulating in our stream, we'll breathe faster to try to get rid of it. The chemoreceptors tell the brain, hey, you need to breathe faster. And the brain stimulates the respiratory system, the lungs, to increase rate and or depth or tidal volume. The blood, another component that helps in keeping the blood going to the cells. There's 4 parts in our blood components. Plasma is the liquid. We also have red blood cells, which carry oxygen-carrying hemoglobin. White blood cells fight infection, and platelets form clots. They are regulated, our bloodstream and the exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide is regulated through plasma oncotic pressure. These are proteins in plasma. They either attract water away from or around the cells and pulls it into the bloodstream so that there's not too much blood or water surrounding the cells. Hydrostatic pressure, water pushes back out of the blood vessels towards the cell. So if there's too much hydrostatic pressure, water is going to be pushed out of the blood vessels, and somebody might have edema or swelling and less water in their vessels. Any problems with the proteins in the plasma can cause an imbalance of pressure. So oncotic pressure attracts water away from our cells and pulls it into the bloodstream. Hydrostatic pressure pushes it back out. Blood dysfunction. Without enough blood, oxygen and carbon dioxide cannot be properly moved around. We can have problems with our blood, either bleeding through cuts or trauma, or dehydration, or even anemia, or liver failure can all cause problems with the blood. Remember, arteries go away from the heart and veins go towards the heart. The vessel or network of arteries and veins are very important to have to play function to in the function of delivery of blood, oxygenated blood. Veins and arteries can change sizes. They have the ability to dilate or constrict. What tells them to dilate or constrict? Once again, our brain. So if you have a disruption in the signals going from the brain to the vessels, they could actually relax and dilate. And then you wouldn't have enough pressure in the arteries to keep the water or the blood circulating. The blood vessels take oxygenated blood from the lungs via the heart to capillaries, where the gas exchange takes place. The gas exchange takes place between the cells and capillaries, and then the return blood to the lungs via the heart for gas exchange, and once again between capillaries and alveoli. So in the body, the exchange takes place between the cells and capillaries. In the lungs, it takes place between the capillaries and alveoli. You need adequate pressure to make that cycle work. Pressure is controlled by the changing diameter of blood vessels. There are stretch receptors in our vessels, and they monitor that pressure. And the pressure can be increased or decreased depending on what the body's needs are. You can have a loss of tone. I just talked about that a minute ago. The vessels lose the ability to constrict, and then they dilate, and then that pressure drops. This can be a result of trauma, infection, or even allergic reactions, and we'll talk about that more in those chapters. So here's a picture of a normal blood vessel on the left and a dilated vessel with a reduced blood volume on the right. Same amount of blood going through the body, but suddenly the vessel has gotten bigger. So blood doesn't fill up the vessel like it should, and the pressure has gone down. This is what you would see in a blood pressure that is dropped. This is one way a blood pressure can drop. The other thing that can happen is they can have excessive permeability. There's that term again. The capillaries leak fluid out of their walls. They become permeable. This can be caused by infection or sepsis. High altitude and other certain diseases can cause the capillaries to leak the fluid out of their walls. And then the body can become dehydrated. Hypertension, that's a high blood pressure. Having a blood pressure depends on something called systemic vascular resistance. That's the vessel resistance in the system. How constricted the vessels are, or how hardened the arteries have become, maybe through plaque buildup, and they don't change their size as easily. This is pressure inside the vessels. If you have a high blood pressure, or hypertension it's called, then you have excessive pressure inside your vessels. A lot of different conditions can lead to this abnormal constriction of vessels that causes the high pressures. This is also a major risk factor in stroke and heart disease. The heart has to pump against those vessels, and also you have plaque buildup that can cause strokes. The heart will pump with average stroke volume, or how much blood it'll circulate or put out in one stroke. It's about 70 milliliters of blood per every contraction. Stroke volume, to have a good stroke volume, you have to have three things. One of them is good preload. That's enough blood returning to the heart to fill it up that it can push it back out. If you don't have anything coming back to fill the heart, then the heart's going to pump and there's nothing that it can push. So preload. You got to have good preload in order to get a good stroke volume. You got to have good contraction. That's how hard the heart squeezes, to squeeze that blood out and get it to circulate. And then afterload. Afterload is the heart pressure the heart has to pump against to force blood out into the system. That's determined on how much systemic vascular resistance you have, how tight your vessels are that your heart is pushing against. So cardiac output is stroke volume, how much blood it can push out in one beat, and you multiply that times beats per minute, and you have what's called cardiac output. So, kind of like the minute volume in respirations. A slowing heart rate or decreasing stroke volume will reduce cardiac output. Very fast heart rates reduce cardiac output because it doesn't have the good stroke volume. There's not enough time for the heart to fill or preload between contractions. A lot of things can cause the heart to dysfunction. You can have mechanical problems from a physical trauma, maybe something has damaged the heart, or from squeezing forces where the sac that surrounds the heart is filling with blood and putting pressure on the heart so it can't fill, or the lung is collapsing and pushing against the heart so it can't circulate blood. Or you could actually have a problem with some of the heart cells themselves dying from not enough oxygen, and that would be a heart attack. You can have electrical problems where maybe the SA node isn't functioning like it should, or the little impulses in the nerves aren't generated regularly. That can damage the heart's ability to regulate the rate. The cardiopulmonary system, then, the entire cardiopulmonary system must work together to maintain life. There must be a balance between ventilation and perfusion. V is ventilation, Q is perfusion for the system to work properly. We kind of can relate that as something called VQ match. It's how well the alveoli are being oxygenated versus how well the circulatory system is able to pump it around. Any breakdown in system impacts ratio, causing a possible life-threatening situation. And that leads us to shock. Shock is all about perfusion. Perfusion is the regular delivery of oxygen and nutrients to cells and the removal of waste products. Hypoperfusion is a breakdown in that system, and it can result in the death of the patient because it starts with the death of the cell. There's 4 categories of shock. Hypovolemic, put that together, it's low volume. That means there's not enough blood circulating around. Either not enough blood or not enough water. Low volume. Distributive shock is a shock that's distributed throughout the whole body. An example of this would be from damage to the nervous system. Affects the whole body. Cardiogenic shock is a shock because the heart is not pumping effectively. And an obstructive shock is a shock that's causing the circulation, the blood not to be able to circulate around the body. It's being obstructed. When problems arise, body attempts to compensate. So when the system isn't working effectively and the cells aren't getting enough oxygen, the body tries to compensate for it. And so some changes take place. You would see the heart start to beat faster. You could see the breathing start to go up. Capillary refill time, if you press on your nail bed until it turns white and you let go, your nail bed should turn pink again within 2 seconds. If it doesn't, then it's a delayed capillary refill. The other thing your body does is as far as compensate is you'll see pale, cool, clammy skin. Tries to constrict the vessels and move them away from the skin so that the blood can be circulated in more vital areas. And then sweating.
What happens to the carbon dioxide that leaves the tissues? Most of it diffuses into the bloodstream, specifically into red blood cells. There, much of the carbon dioxide is rapidly converted to carbonic acid by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. The carbonic acid then dissociates, releasing a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, that is, a proton. As a result, the blood pH drops. Changes in pH affect the shape of hemoglobin and thus its ability to bind oxygen. For a given partial PO2 value, hemoglobin can bind less oxygen at lower blood pH and more oxygen at higher blood pH. This effect is known as the Bohr shift. The drop in blood pH leads to the unloading of oxygen by hemoglobin. The protons released by the dissociation of carbonic acid bind to deoxygenated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin thereby acts as a buffer, preventing large swings in blood pH. In the form of bicarbonate ions, carbon dioxide can thus be transported by the bloodstream from the tissues to the lungs with a minimal effect on blood pH. When deoxygenated blood reaches the alveoli, the environment changes dramatically. In the lungs, a concentration gradient favors the diffusion of CO2 from the plasma and red blood cells to the atmosphere. The partial PCO2 of the blood drops, promoting a reversal of the reaction that occurred in the tissues. Bicarbonate is converted back to CO2, which then diffuses into the alveoli and is exhaled by the lungs. With the next inhalation, oxygen is picked up, and the cycle continues.
So other systems also play into pathophysiology of shock. For instance, fluid balance. Our body is 60% water. 70% of that is in the cells. 5% is in the vessels. 25% is interstitial, which means it's between the vessels and the cells. So, water comprises approximately 60% of the body weight, and the water is distributed in those three spaces equally. But once in a while, those can shift. Water can shift into and out of the cells or the vascular space. The brain and kidneys regulate thirst and elimination of excess fluid. That's important to have our kidneys functioning. Blood plasma proteins, so the proteins that are in plasma, pull fluid into the bloodstream to keep enough fluid for the red blood cells to get circulated around. Cell membrane and capillary permeability regulate the flow in and out. If that permeability of the cell membrane breaks down, then you're going to have a dysfunction and the water is going to shift out of the cells, or sometimes you can have a dysfunction where it pulls water into the cells, and either way, it breaks down the cell. Fluid loss is a dehydration. It's a decrease in total water volume. You could also have poor fluid distribution. The water's not getting to where it needs to be, or it's shifting out and causing edema or swelling. It's too much water in some parts of the body. The nervous system, brain and spinal cord are well protected by the skull and spine. They're also covered by several protective layers called meninges and a layer of shock-absorbing fluid, which is cerebral spinal fluid. But it can still be damaged, your brain can, from trauma or disease. Remember, there's just a fixed space in the brain. So a change in anything, either swelling of the brain or an increase in blood or spinal fluid, is going to cause an increased pressure on the other contents of the brain. So you can have a trauma to your brain or spinal cord from motor vehicle crashes, falls, or diving accidents. And if that happens, that you have an injury to your spinal cord, you're going to disrupt the ability of the brain to send signals to the rest of the body. You can also have a medical dysfunction of the brain or spinal cord, such as a stroke. Not enough oxygen getting to the brain because of a blood clot, or a stroke where a blood vessel in the brain bleeds. You could have an infection to the lining, meningitis, or an encephalitis where there's an infection causing swelling. There could be a disease such as Lou Gehrig's disease or multiple sclerosis, or even a low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, and there's not enough sugar in the blood to feed the cells. The endocrine system, these are glands that secrete hormones, and the hormones send chemical message to the body to control the body functions. Some major organs in that system include the brain, the kidneys, the pancreas. Once again, the pancreas distributes insulin, creates insulin. You have the pituitary gland or the master gland, the thyroid gland, and then you have adrenal glands that actually make adrenaline. So the endocrine system you can have organ or gland problems. Sometimes this is you have them when you're born, or you could get it because of an illness. You could have too many hormones, such as Graves' disease, where the thyroid is producing too much. Or you could have problems with heart rate and temperature regulation because of too much hormones. Or not enough hormones, such as the case of diabetes, where you don't make enough insulin. The digestive system allows food, water, and other nutrients to enter the body. Some major organs of that system include the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines. If you have problems with the digestive system, that's going to impact your hydration levels and also your nutrient transfer. You could have problems with that, such as gastrointestinal bleeding. You can be a slow bleed, a chronic bleed, but it takes a long time to develop. Maybe you've got a little bit of bleed would show up in maybe your feces, or it can be a massive bleed and have bright red bleeding through the rectum, or even vomiting up blood. Vomiting and diarrhea, these are common disorders, and there can be a lot of causes from it. Can be malnutrition, or it can be dehydration, or even maybe a virus or a bacteria. and causing problems in your digestive system. Either way, it affects the regulation of your body water and even the nutrition for your cells. The immune system is responsible for fighting infection. It responds to specific body invaders by identifying them, marking them, and then destroying them. An allergic reaction is a hypersensitive response from your immune system. And some people are allergic to things like peanuts or seafood are common things, but you can have an exaggerated immune response, and the chemicals then are going after the invader and causing all kinds of havoc to your body, and you'll have a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis. Anaphylactic or allergic reactions can produce edema, once again shifting that fluid in your body, and then your blood pressure will drop. The fluid is leaking out of your vessels because the vessels have become more permeable, and this can be life-threatening. So let's review. Pathophysiology allows us to understand how negative forces impact the normal function of the body. Pathophysiology helps us understand how common disorders cause changes in the body. If you can understand what's going on in the body, you can do appropriate things to help the person feel better or even fix the problem. So, understanding how the body compensates for insults sheds light on the signs and symptoms we may see during assessment. And then understanding what our body does to compensate helps us rapidly identify potentially life-threatening problems. Cellular metabolism requires a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. Absence of either component disrupts normal metabolism. The cardiopulmonary system combines the functions of respiratory and cardiovascular systems to provide oxygen at the cellular level. Shock occurs when the cardiopulmonary system fails and cells become hypoperfused. The body is composed primarily of water, and this fluid is distributed throughout the body systems. So, you're evaluating a patient with a cardiac problem. Consider the impact on the respiratory system. When evaluating a patient with a respiratory problem, consider the impact on the cardiovascular system. And whatever impacts these systems have on each other, you need to identify those problems and see what you can do to fix them. Shock must be recognized immediately. What is the pathophysiology of shock? Well, you're either going to have a problem with not enough oxygen getting in, or maybe a problem with the oxygen not being able to circulate around. So you can have a problem with the pump, the heart, so to speak, or you could have a problem with the container, the vessels, dilating or constricting, or you could have a problem with the blood and it not being able to transport the oxygen around. You're treating a patient who was recently released from the intensive care unit with a massive infection or sepsis. This has impaired the patient's ability to regulate the size of the blood vessels. So what is going to happen? The blood vessels will dilate. What happens to the volume of blood in his body? It may be the same amount of blood, but it no longer fills up his vessels, and therefore his blood pressure will go down. How might this affect the patient's ability to compensate for any additional illnesses? What steps should you take to help this patient compensate? Think about it. Maybe give him a little bit more oxygen to circulate around. Maybe he needs a little more fluid somehow to fill up that space. Or maybe he might need something to help constrict his vessels.